All right, thank you so much for being here with us today to talk about this important topic. Again, my name is Tanja Philhower, and I'm the social worker here at the Veterinary Medical Center. And so the human-animal bond is why we are all here today. The relationships that we share with our pets are unique, and they add meaning, companionship, joy, laughter, love, structure, routine, familiarity, all of these really important things to our lives. And I have lots of clients who talk to me and let me know that they feel even closer bonds to their non-human animal companions than they do to their human animal companions. And then along with these close bonds, of course, means that when our animal companions die, then we feel intense grief at those losses. And so the goals of our presentation today are to discuss planning for end of life for our pets, what to expect from grief, ways to cope with grief, and ways to honor your deceased pet. And so there are different types of loss. We can experience the loss of our pets in multiple different ways. Some, unfortunately, may experience sudden and unexpected death of their pets, and that might be accompanied by a traumatic event. We may experience expected death of our pets after chronic or extended illness, or we may experience the expected death of a pet related to aging, which I think is what we all hope for, that our beloved animal companions will live their full lives and be able to have peaceful deaths at the end of a long life. Some of us may be in a position where we have to surrender a pet to a family member, a friend, or shelter because of our own illnesses or injuries or other changes in circumstances that might prevent us from continuing to own and care for our pets. And the impact of these losses may be different, and how we experience grief may be different depending on the nature of the loss. Many times, loss that is accompanied by a traumatic event may really complicate the grieving process. And so that's part of the reason why I mentioned these different ways that we might experience loss because of the impacts that they may have on grief. And so ideally, when we're thinking about planning for end of life, it's best to start thinking about planning for the end of life well before any illness strikes. And it might feel strange or uncomfortable to already start thinking about our pets' deaths when they are healthy and we don't have these issues in front of us. But it is much more difficult to make decisions and to make decisions that we feel good about when we're under emotional duress. And so having these types of structures and plans in place before we have to make these types of decisions can just make it easier for us to develop a plan that we feel good about and make it easier to implement that plan when the time comes. So things to think about that may affect decision-making regarding end-of-life planning are finances. Certainly we all have budgets that we have to live within, and it is okay to consider our finances and thinking about how we may be able to care for our pets at the end of their lives. Our own physical limitations, so we may be bringing our own health issues with us into trying to care for our pets at the end of their lives, then that may impact what we're able to provide in the way of care at home. And then our own values and beliefs regarding quality of life, quality of death, and euthanasia should certainly be a part of any end-of-life planning. It's helpful to plan together, so think about who is invested in these decisions. If your animal companion is part of a family, then talking with all of your family members about their thoughts about these things to try to develop a holistic plan that feels comfortable for everyone who loves your pet. would be a great way to approach this. Or if you are living alone with your pet, it may be a good idea to talk with your primary care veterinarian about their thoughts and get their input. Maybe talk with other trusted friends who also are dedicated pet owners about how they've approached end-of-life planning for their pets to get a full picture of what, what options might be available. And then keep a record of the plan that you create so that you can refer back to that when the time comes. It'll be a lot easier to remember the decisions that you've made and the intentions that you have for your pet if you've written these things down and can look at them during those times when you have perhaps received difficult news and may be quite emotional and wanting to make the decisions that are in the best interest of your pet. And then also going back to the plan and amending it as needed as your own personal circumstances change. Perhaps you change jobs and you end up with a financial capacity that would allow you to provide more care, or perhaps financial situations change and you'll have less financial capacity, or something has changed with your own physical health. But going back and amending that plan as needed to reflect your current life circumstances is also something that will be helpful to make sure that when the time comes that you have the right plan in place for you. And so thinking about quality of life for our pets can be a little bit difficult. It's sometimes quality of life can be difficult to assess because it is so subjective. And unfortunately, our pets can't talk to us with words to tell us how they're feeling. And so we have to do a lot in the way of observation and trying to be connected to what's going on with our pets to really determine what kind of quality of life they have, particularly when they're experiencing an extended illness. There's unfortunately no clear answer to know exactly when is the right time to consider euthanasia. And so it's something that can be really helpful to gauge quality of life over a period of time, either when your pet has received a diagnosis of a chronic or long-term illness, or when your pet is starting to get much older and you know that perhaps the end of their life might be approaching. Keeping a journal about their quality of life, or your observations about their quality of life, or some sort of a log, maybe using a calendar to keep track of quality of life over time, will help you to be able to quantify those subtle changes that occur over time. We're in any given day, we're seeing what we see, and it may be difficult for us to notice that there's been a substantial change over a period of a month when those changes have occurred in tiny increments over the days within that month. So using a journal or a calendar or log to keep track may be really helpful. There's also lots of really great quality of life screening tools online, and we'll be giving some of that information in the follow-up email to this presentation. But they take different forms. So again, some of them are, kind of journals to help you keep track. Other tools assign numerical values to different quality of life indicators to help you decide, to help you keep track or assign a number value to your pet's quality of life on any given day. And that also can help track those changes in a little more quantifiable way over time. And so the things that we will often talk about when we talk about quality of life for pets are things like mobility. So how well is your pet appearing to get around? How much assistance do you have to provide for them to get around? Are they still able to, jump up to their favorite spot on the couch or chair? Can they still go outside and, use the restroom on their own? So what does their mobility look like? Pain, of course, is one that we really want to be thinking about because none of us want for our pets to be in great pain. So is your pet displaying signs of pain, such as whining or panting, perhaps sensitivity to being touched? Cats in particular can be hard to gauge pain, but a lot of times when cats are feeling in pain, they may really start to hide away from family or from other pets in a way that they wouldn't have before. Appetite. Is your pet eating a typical diet? Are they still getting excited for meals or treats? And of course, all of these things are going to be, again, subjective and different from pet to pet. I have 2 dogs. One of them is very food driven and she gets super excited for every single meal. And if we would feed her 10 times a day, she'd get excited 10 times a day to eat a meal. And my other dog is a grazer and he doesn't always eat his food right when we put it out, and he gets to it when he feels like it. And so, for judging his appetite based on mealtime behavior wouldn't be a good measure for him, but it is definitely a good measure for my other dog. But treats are something that they both get very excited about. And so if I brought out treats and either one of them weren't really getting excited for treats anymore, I would know that there was a problem. Breathing, of course, is going to be another important indicator. Is your pet showing signs of struggling to breathe? Some of those signs might be things like wheezing, coughing, or open mouth breathing. Particularly cats do not typically open mouth breathe. And so if you see that in your cat, that's usually a sign of a problem. Hygiene. Is your pet struggling to control their urination or their bowel movements? Is your cat struggling to keep their bowel movements and urination inside of the litter box? Are they going in inappropriate places? Also thinking about for cats, have their self-grooming behaviors deteriorated? Are they struggling to move their body in a way that they can reach some of those more difficult to reach places that they want to clean? Or have they just kind of given up on grooming altogether? Those are really important signs. Most of our pets don't want to be using the restroom in places where they live and cohabitate with us. And so if those things start to happen, that's going to be uncomfortable for them. And again, another sign that their quality of life is deteriorating. And then there's these pieces that are going to, again, be really individual to each pet. So thinking about their social engagement and their general enjoyment. Is your pet still engaged with loved ones? Are they still enjoying favorite activities like bird watching or playing with toys? I have a cat named Frank, and Frank likes to sit in the window every single day. We have multiple big windows on the front of our house, and he likes to watch the birds. Back before the bird flu, we had lots of bird feeders in the front yard, and he would watch the bird feeders all day. And now he still keeps an eye in the front yard. And I would know that something is wrong with him if he's not enjoying that behavior anymore, if he's not enjoying bird watching and looking outside and seeing what's happening in the front yard. So what are your pet's favorite things to do? What are what are their favorite toys or the things that they like to do that really make them who they are and that, bring enjoyment to their lives and to your life for engaging in those activities with them? And going back to some of those online indicators, a lot of them, like some of those online quality of life tools will like assign numerical values to, these different metrics. And then, one of the things that you can think about too in terms of quality of life is, perhaps deciding ahead of time that, if my pet's maximum quality of life was 35. But I know that once that quality of life drops below 15, that I know that they don't have the kind of life that I would want them to have anymore. And that would be the time that I know that, that they're not happy and that their quality of life is such that I don't think that I want them to continue to suffer in the way that they seem to be. Or you could also, just choose a couple of these metrics. Like if, my dog doesn't get excited for treats anymore and isn't able to jump on the bed to sleep with me at night anymore, and, doesn't seem to enjoy going on their daily walk with me anymore. Those are the, key activities that really make my dog who he is. And if he's not doing those things anymore, then I know that he doesn't have a good quality of life anymore. Just kind of using some of this information to try to figure out what is the boundary for you, and what do you want your pet's quality of life to look like. And so quality of life for you as well is an important factor in these decisions. You matter too. And your pets love you and they sense when you're physically and emotionally struggling. That's part of why our relationships with our pets mean so very much. It's because they are so in tune with us and sometimes can sense things about us again that our human companions don't necessarily sense. And so if you are in pain, watching your pet struggle, or if you are physically struggling to provide your pet with the care that they need, they are going to know that, and that's going to have an impact on their quality of life as well. But also thinking about financial challenges. Are you struggling to pay your bills, to buy food for yourself, to buy your own medications because of the financial strain of providing medical care for your pet? If you are, that might be a time to reconsider the plans that you're making. Are you experiencing physical challenges of providing care for your pets? Are you getting up multiple times a night and having your sleep disrupted because your pet has to go outside to go potty multiple times because their bladder control is limited? Or are you forgetting to pay attention to your own nutrition? Are you struggling to physically administer medication? Not all of our cats and dogs like to have, to take their medications, and it can be a real struggle to try to administer those. And, there might even be times where we could become injured in the course of trying to administer medication to our pets. If that's the case, that's another time to really think about whether or not the plan we have in place is continuing to work anymore. And then the emotional challenges of providing care. It is painful to be a caregiver for someone who we love, whose health is deteriorating. Are you struggling with anticipatory grief, knowing that your time left with your pet is not that much longer? The pain of watching your pet's condition decline. All of those things are also important to assess when thinking about quality of life and about, the plans that you have in place for end-of-life care. And so we do have so many end-of-life options that we can utilize to provide a quality and peaceful and compassionate death for our pets. We're lucky in our area to have a pet hospice care or nonprofit organization called Peaceful Passing for Pets. It was started by a human health hospice nurse who felt like she really wanted to see the same type of compassionate care provided to our animal companions at the end of their lives. There's also multiple wonderful in-home euthanasia services. Sometimes one of the things that people struggle with in thinking about euthanasia is that they don't want their pets to die in a hospital or in an environment that feels cold or sterile. They want for them to be comfortable and at home. And so our home euthanasia services provide all-inclusive euthanasias that are conducted in people's homes by trained veterinarians who go through the entire process with you at home and can help create a really meaningful, peaceful, and compassionate death for our pets. Also, sometimes people really want for the euthanasia to be performed by the doctors who have been providing care for their pets, either throughout their lives or, in the course of their illness, and, want for those euthanasias to be conducted in the clinic or hospital where they receive that care. There's also multiple cremation services that are available in our area so that after your pet has died, that you can still have, have their ashes with you and use those to create memorials to them in the ways that feel meaningful to you. And any of these services that are here in the presentation can be Googled, and we'll easily show you the links to these organizations' websites so that you can look them up if you need to utilize them yourselves. I'll also note that Minnesota Pets has a really just wonderful all-inclusive website for thinking about end-of-life care. They have lots and lots of resources on their website. And so, once our pets have ultimately passed, we're going to then start to experience grief. And so thinking about grief, grief is a normal human experience that occurs as the result of a significant loss. And that loss could be the death of a loved one, whether it's a human or non-human loved one. It could be the loss or ending of a significant relationship, or the loss or ending of an identifying role. And grief is individual. And so everyone grieves in their own way and time. And the same person may grieve differently at different times in their lives. Different relationships, different losses may invoke different types of grief depending on what the nature of those relationships was. So there isn't one picture of what we can expect grief to look like. Grief also doesn't have a defined set of stages that people move through in some sort of linear fashion, and we can check off a stage and then move to the next stage. And once we've checked all the stages off, grief is over. That's just not how grief works. I think we're all familiar with the kind of traditional Kubler-Ross model of grief, where we go through these 5 stages of denial, bargaining, anger, depression, and acceptance. And we get to acceptance and everything's all good and we're done with grief. And that's just not how it works. Grief is something that is going to stay with us. And really, I think a lovely way of thinking about grief is that it is really the form that our love takes after the death of our loved one. It's the extension of that relationship after our loved one has died. And so types of grief, there's that acute phase of grief that occurs in the early period after loss, and that feels so very painful. And it's defined by strong feelings of yearning and longing and sorrow for the one that we've lost. The acute stage of grief might be defined by persistent thoughts and memories of the object of the loss. We may experience anxiety, anger, remorse, guilt, shame, and isolation. And activities are often focused on coping with the loss. And that acute stage of grief is, again, really the most overwhelming and painful, and the one that, people struggle with the most. But hopefully, if we are healing and taking care of ourselves and we get the type of support that we need, we can ultimately move into a state of adapted or integrated grief. So grief over the loss of a loved one is permanent. There's never a time where we're going to wake up and be like, yeah, I'm fine with the fact that Daisy died and I don't miss her anymore. Like that's not how grief works. Our relationships are permanent and they hold a permanent place in our memories and in our hearts. So grief lasts, but the intensity of that grief and the acute nature of that grief doesn't last over time. And we will eventually get to an equilibrium and a state of new normal where we've adjusted to what life looks like without our loved pet, our loved one. And we can still find comfort and joy in memories, even if those might still be twinged with hints of sadness. And for some people, we can experience complicated or prolonged grief. In complicated or prolonged grief, somebody kind of gets stuck in that state of acute grief or somewhere in between acute and integrated grief. And it might be exemplified by excessive focus on what ifs or if only type of thinking that can prevent acceptance of the loss. So what if I had not stayed late at work and had come home sooner? Maybe I would have seen that, that Daisy was struggling and needed to go to the emergency room. Or if only I had decided to, do the chemotherapy treatment, maybe she would have lived longer. Um, and focusing on those types of thinking long term can really prevent us to getting to the point where that grief becomes integrated. A lot of times, too, people might feel excessive feelings of anger, guilt, or shame. And I think a lot of times for caregivers of pets, that guilt and shame can be a big piece of grief for caregivers. Again, feeling like maybe I didn't do enough. Maybe I feeling guilty or ashamed, thinking that I, gave up too soon and should have tried more treatment options to prolong my pet's life. Or on the other side of it, feeling guilty or ashamed that maybe I let this go on too long and I let Daisy suffer for my own sense of comfort and my own desire to not want to lose her companionship. And those feelings of guilt can be really powerful. And so grief in this prolonged form might require intervention or treatment in order to heal. Typically, grief doesn't necessarily require intervention, again, because grief is a normal human emotion and a normal reaction, a healthy reaction to the loss of a significant, important relationship. And so we don't necessarily need treatment for our feelings, again, unless we get to the point where we get stuck in that most acute state and can't get to the place of acceptance and integration with our grief. And so, what can we expect from those early stages of acute grief? Emotions that we might feel could feel a lot like a roller coaster. A lot of ups and downs, feeling sadness and anger. And again, that guilt and shame can be particularly acute for caregivers. Another thing that I encounter a lot with grief over the death of a pet that is, I think, in some ways unique to the death of a pet is feeling guilty or ashamed for even feeling grief, because we do encounter a lot of societal messages from people who don't know what it's like to have such a strong bond with a pet, of kind of being like, why are you so upset about your dog dying? It's just a dog or it's just a cat. And that can really isolate people and intensify those feelings of guilt or shame that we naturally experience as part of grief anyway. Thoughts. People might end up having intrusive memories of last moments. That can be particularly difficult, and a real kind of a real struggle for people whose animals died in a traumatic way. So if there was an accident or some sort of traumatic illness that was sudden in onset, that created a visual memory, that can be really very difficult to work through. Again, those thoughts that can focus on that kind of what if type of thinking, kind of really wondering how things could have been different. Difficulty concentrating, focusing, difficulty processing information that's provided to us, and difficulty making decisions are all part of grief. And this is also part of why I encourage you to think about that end of life planning before you receive difficult news, because grief can really start, especially can really start in those moments when we receive the diagnosis of a terminal illness, when we learn that our dog has cancer and that their time with us is limited. We start grieving already right then. And we already start struggling to process information, to focus, to concentrate, and to make decisions. And so if we've already thought through how we would want to approach these types of situations, it can make it easier then to manage decision making when we are also trying to cope with grief. Physical impacts of grief. Grief is not just an emotion, it is a whole body experience. And so we are going to feel physical impacts of our grief in addition to the emotional and cognitive impacts of our grief. So oftentimes people who are grieving will experience changes to their sleep patterns. They might be sleeping too much, they might be sleeping but generally may feel a sense of fatigue and exhaustion. People might experience nightmares or night terrors that interfere with their sleep and their ability to get quality rest. A lot of times people might experience appetite changes, maybe just don't feel hungry anymore, and that can make it very difficult to focus on getting adequate nutrition. People might experience having displaced expressions of anger or rage. Maybe you end up, shouting at a vet tech who is helping with providing care for your pet because you're feeling so angry and frustrated, even though that's not really who you're angry at, and you know that. And so those kinds of things can feel really shocking and upsetting when we experience it, especially if we're not people who are prone to being angry or upset. But those are normal reactions when we're grieving. And then withdrawing from family, friends, and loved ones. And again, this can be really counterproductive because one of the protective factors in terms of being able to grieve in a healthy way is having social support. And so then when we withdraw from our friends and family, we miss out on that social support that we really need in order to be able to grieve effectively. Challenging times that we might encounter in regards to grief are going to perhaps be milestones. So perhaps your pet's birthday or the day that you adopted your pet, the date of their death. Also thinking about those firsts without. So perhaps the first time that you go camping without your dog, the first time that you experience going up to the cabin in the summertime without your dog. Those firsts without can also be really painful. And then there are these kind of contradictions of grief. Grief, a lot of times people want to just get done with it because it is so painful and it is so all consuming, and we just want it to be over. We want to feel better, but then we also don't want to stop grieving, because if we stop grieving, we fear that maybe that means that I don't love my pet or that I'm dishonoring them somehow by not grieving. And so that's one of those contradictions that can be really difficult to manage. Also, kind of the push and pull of wanting to have people close to us and to be around people, but then not wanting to harm people or make them, draw them into our pain. And so then we withdraw from the people around us. Those contradictions of grief can be really difficult to manage and to cope with and make sense of. So what are some ways that we can manage our grief? One of the first things that we can do is accept that grief is a natural response to profound loss. And it's a continuation and an expression of the love for the pet that we've lost. Grief is not something that we can escape. And so one of the things that we can do for this too is really noticing those moments when our grief is more or less intense. We might feel like we're constantly at a 10 in terms of the amount of pain that we're experiencing in moments of grief, and that all day we're at a 10. But really, if we think about it, there may be those moments where actually my grief is more like at a 5, and then something happens and then it is more up at that level of a 10. And so what's happening in those moments that create more sense of grief and pain and loss, and what's happening when we get those moments of relief? Practicing self-compassion and avoiding judging your experience with grief. This is also, I think it sounds really simple, but it can be a really hard thing to do, particularly when many of us get so many kind of judging messages about grief, from the world around us. It can be hard to be compassionate with ourselves and to allow ourselves to experience what we are without judgment. But it is really important to have patience for yourself, to have patience for your grieving, and to not try to set a time limit on how long grief should take. Allow yourself to cry or not cry as those moments come. Be okay with where you are in a given moment. Allow yourself to experience positive emotions as they come too. Our pets would not want us to be miserable for the rest of our lives. Our pets are happy when we are happy, and they would not want us to experience the deep pain at their loss forever. And so if you have a moment of joy or laughter or happiness, even in the midst of grief, allow yourself to have that moment without judgment. Making sure that you're attending to your physical health needs. And again, this is one of those things that sounds really simple to do, but it's something that we often neglect when we're grieving, but yet it's so important for us to be able to grieve in a healthy way. So really making sure that you're keeping track of your sleep hygiene, still trying to go to bed at the same time every night and get your full night's sleep and get up, when you would normally get up. Keeping track of your nutrition, making sure that you are eating enough to maintain your energy. And so even if you're not feeling like you have an appetite, set an alarm to remind yourself to eat a small meal. Eat things that you enjoy that are going to nourish you and help you to, feel comforted. Eat small meals throughout the day if you don't feel like eating a full breakfast, but making sure that you're keeping track of your nutrition. And then engaging in other forms of self-care. That might mean making sure that you're continuing to take your own medications for your own health conditions. Continuing to pay attention to your hygiene, making sure that you're staying connected to people, but attending to those physical health needs that you have as well. Making sure to intentionally engage in a comforting activity each day. This is important too, to remember to nurture ourselves. And a comforting activity is going to look different for each of us. Maybe a comforting activity is taking a walk through your neighborhood every day. Maybe it's having a warm cup of coffee or tea in the morning, listening to your favorite music. Perhaps it's doing a crossword puzzle or reading your favorite book, but trying to make sure that you are taking a moment each day to do something small and comforting for yourself. Staying connected with supportive friends and loved ones. This is also so important because, again, we've got that instinct to withdraw, but really one of the most protective factors when it comes to healing from grief is being connected and having that sense of connection and support from others. It's also important to remember that well-meaning people in our lives can say hurtful, unhelpful things, and trying to maintain a sense of forgiveness for people who may say those hurtful, unhelpful things. I think very commonly people who are grieving the death of a pet might hear people say things like, oh, well, she had a good long life and, it was time to say goodbye, which might be true, but you still would prefer to have your pet with you, even though they had a good long life. Or having someone say, oh, well, just go get another kitten. Well, another kitten isn't going to replace your lost sweet Jasmine. So that's not super helpful either. But the reason that people say these things isn't with the intent typically to be hurtful. Typically people say these kinds of things because they see you hurting and they want to try to provide some sense of relief, even if it might be misguided. Focus on what you know to be true about your experience and the fact that your grief that you're experiencing is real and it is valid and it is meaningful. And consider too seeking support from a group such as Calm. We here at the U, we have a grief support group for people who are grieving the death of pets, so that you can find affirmation and comfort from other people who know what it's like to experience deep grief at the death of a pet. And then gradually, as you're able, start to incorporate memories of your beloved pet back into your life. So allowing yourself to look at pictures, sharing memories of your pet with family and loved ones, but staying connected with those memories. One of the things that I hear too a lot of times from people is that they're afraid to let go of their grief because they're afraid that they are going to forget their pet. And that's just not how grief works. That's not how memory works. Just because we don't have our pet physically with us does not mean that we are going to forget them. And one way to kind of assure ourselves that we're going to maintain our memories of our pets is by, again, allowing ourselves to intentionally engage with those memories in a way that is not just kind of steeped in pain. And so things too, once we get to the point where we're ready to start thinking about this is, we can also look at ways that we can very intentionally honor the lives of our pets. And so some people might choose to create a memory spot in your home or your garden or your yard where you might place pictures of your pet, or maybe have one of their favorite toys that you keep in that spot, or other things that can help remind you of your pet and who they were and the spot that they held in your life. Perhaps keeping a journal of your memories about your pet, and continuing to add to the journal as memories arise. You might be taking a walk and you see something that triggers a memory of a time that you were on a walk with your dog and they did something really, really cute or funny or interesting. And so, when you get home, write that memory down, and ask other people to contribute their memories to the journal as well. Other people who loved your pet and who interacted with them might have really fun stories to share that would be helpful to have a part of that memory journal. Creating a photo album or a scrapbook or a digital photo montage or a video, that might also be a meaningful way to stay connected with your pet. Perhaps planting a tree or a shrub or a flower in memory of your pet. I also worked with a client who lived in a condo and she didn't have her own yard to plant in, but she contacted one of her local parks and was able to have a tree planted with a plaque in memory of her deceased dog. And that was really meaningful for her because she and her dog used to go for walks in that park. And so now she's able to still walk in that park and see that tree that she was able to plant in memory of her dog. Thinking about perhaps things that you can place in your home that will remind you to have positive memories of your pet. So maybe some wind chimes that when you hear the wind chimes, you remember to reflect on positive memories of your pet, or a sun catcher that when you see the light glinting, that you can have that be a trigger to reflect on positive memories of your pet. And then thinking about other ideas that might be unique to you, to your pet, to your family. Perhaps your dog loved to swim in the lake up at your family cabin. Maybe you bring a bench to the lakeside so that you can sit on the edge of the lake, and that's that bench is the spot that you can sit and remember all the times that your dog sat in the lake. Perhaps your family was really deeply impacted by the care that they received here at the U, and you think about, donating to a fund to help other people provide similar type of care to their pets in times of need. Maybe there's other ways that you and your family are able to come up with a unique way to honor your pet. And you could do one of these or all of these, or come up with an idea all of your own. But engaging with memories of your pet in a positive way, again, is a really important way to heal and to start coming to that place of really healthy, integrated grief. And so that's the end of the presentation. And so now would be a time to take any questions that you may have.
Factors do you look to when deciding if an animal has a good quality of life?
Yeah, and so again, I think that that's something that can be really, again, unique to your pet. And I think kind of thinking about that, how do I know that it's time? Again, I think it can be helpful to really think about that before it's gotten to the point where we need to be having an answer to that question. And so, again, if you've had a diagnosis of a chronic illness, and you know that you want to pursue treatment for that chronic illness, but you also know that you don't want your pet to suffer, perhaps thinking about, again, those elements that make your pet who they are. And so, maybe their favorite thing is to, go for a long walk every day when you get home from work, and they always love their greenies treats, and, they always love to sleep by your bed at night. And if you know that those are kind of the three things that really provide great quality of life and connection for you all together, you may decide that, once those three elements are gone from their life, and perhaps they can't go for walks anymore because they're in too much pain, and they're not interested in their treats anymore because they're just feeling so yucky, and they've started sleeping in a different place and they're not sleeping next to your bed anymore. Like, that's when I know that my dog is no longer himself anymore, and it's going to be time to say goodbye. But making those kind of concrete decisions ahead of time. Also, some of the quality of life scales that I was talking about have numerical values that are assigned to them. And so if that's one of the tools that you're using to try to keep track of quality of life, they'll have different numbers that you can assign to different elements of your pet's well-being, like what we had talked about with regard to pain and hygiene and appetite and things like that. So you may decide ahead of time that, like, once this number, this quality of life number drops below 15, then I know that we've reached the point that their quality of life isn't what I would want it to be for them anymore. But I think that it's most helpful when you have the opportunity to do so, to kind of make some of those decisions again before the time is there, so that when the time comes, that you already know that we decided this a while ago, that this is what we want quality of life to look like for Leo. And once we get to that point with Leo, we're going to prepare to say our goodbyes, or to plan for humane euthanasia, or whatever we've kind of prepared for.
Sure.
Yeah.
So this person asked, do you recommend getting a puppy when your current dog is getting older? And they said, so about 8 years old, in order to help with the inevitable grieving process for the older dog.
Yeah. So I think that those are also really individual decisions. Getting a puppy is not going to keep you from grieving the death of the dog that you've already got. And, certainly having another pet in the home when a pet that we love has died can help create some of that, help maintain some of our routine, maintain, give us that reason to get up in the morning and, focus our energy on this other pet, experience moments of joy with that other pet. But I think that the most important thing is really, do I want to be a 2-dog home? Do I want to have 2 dogs at once? And so if the answer to that is yes, then absolutely get another puppy. But if the main motivation for that is to try to prevent grief from happening or lessen the impact of grief, that in and of itself is probably not going to work. You're still going to experience grief and loss at the death of a pet, no matter whether you have other pets in the home or not. So it's really more so an issue of, do I want to be a multi-dog household? And if the answer to that is yes, then sure, absolutely.
And what about, I know we had this too, people who had dogs that were bonded, or they had 2 dogs together for a long time. How do they try to help the surviving dog when one passes?
So I think that helping the surviving dog, giving lots of attention. I think trying to be really intentional about providing, attention, and sticking with normal routines. So, if you always would go for a walk in the afternoon when you get home from work with both dogs together, keep doing that with your surviving dog. Keep those routines together. And, focusing then too on the activities that your surviving dog enjoys, and, trying to, continue to engage in those, even on the days where it might feel hard for you because you're also grieving. thing. But, animals don't necessarily experience that grief in the same way that we do. And so they, may be a little bit lonely at not having their animal companion there, but they will still have you. And so, again, having that like sense of normalcy and routine that's directed by you, I think it's going to be, some of the things that are more helpful. I don't think necessarily rushing to get another pet to try to kind of fill that absence is necessarily always the best way to go, because that can, again, come along with its own challenges. And so those decisions should really be more, I think, based on, is this really what's best for our household as a whole, and not necessarily trying to look at that as a solution to helping with grief.
Sure. Someone asked, does the U still have a grief support group, and does it meet in person or virtually?
Yes. So we do still have a grief support group. We're in the process of trying to transition from meeting virtually to meeting in person. So we have been meeting virtually through most of COVID. My intention is to start meeting in person over the summer. We're changing the format of our group a little bit as well. So it used to be more of an open-ended group where people could kind of come and go at will, that met twice a month. And now we're going to be moving to more of a kind of a shortened format where people will join group together and attend 4 or 5 sessions together. And then we'll have the opportunity to stay connected with each other kind of at the end of group. But I think this will help people to kind of move through their questions about grief and their experiences with grief and learning about grief together with a closer cohort of peers who are going through similar losses.
Sure. We got this a few times, and I know you talked a little bit about making these decisions as a whole household if you have multiple people in your house. So what is a good way to describe a pet's death to younger children, or to help them cope with these transitions?
Yeah. So I think that kids have a lot more capacity to understand and to cope with grief and loss than we often give them credit for. And so I think using age-appropriate language with kids to talk about death and to talk about euthanasia, avoiding using language like, putting a dog to sleep. That kind of language can cause fear and anxiety in kids, and wondering like, oh gosh, well, if I go to sleep, am I going to wake up? So making sure that we're talking about our dogs dying, and if our pet has a chronic illness, talking about that illness and how that's making our pet feel. And how that's taking an impact on their body, and then talking about how when they die, that means that they won't be with us anymore, but that doesn't mean that we won't still love them, and that place that they've held in our lives isn't still going to have an incredible amount of meaning and positive memories. And there's some really great books that are available. I think one of the links that we're sharing is from Minnesota Pets, and they have a number of books about grieving the death of a pet that you can use to kind of help start those conversations with kids. Sometimes kids can kind of process information in story form a little bit easier as well. And so I would recommend those books. I've got a couple of them myself. Another one I think that isn't on their website, but that I've heard good things about from some colleagues is a book by Fred Rogers. I think it's called The Invisible Leash. And it's also kind of about coping with the death of a pet. So again, using books as a way to kind of help talk about, like, start those conversations about death and dying are, I think, good ways, good places to start, and can also help make those conversations easier for us too.
Sure. All right, we have time for one more question. So we did have a few questions about balancing these end-of-life decisions with financial constraints. How can people manage this emotionally with what options they have or don't have so they can feel ready to move forward with euthanasia if they can't afford extensive care options, perhaps?
Yeah. And so I think that some of that really, yeah, all of those situations are so individual. And I think that how much we love our pets doesn't necessarily correlate to how much money we have to spend on our pets. And I think remembering that we can provide loving, compassionate care to our pets within whatever our means might be, and that we can also provide them a peaceful death that is hopefully, keeping them from experiencing suffering when we get to the point where we can't necessarily afford to continue treatment. I think it's helpful to try to look at things in that way. But love and companionship, they can't be measured in dollars. And so I think just giving ourselves permission to know that we do have budgets. We have to keep a roof over our head. We have to still be able to buy food and maintain our households, and that it's not wrong to prioritize our own health and safety, because if we're not prioritizing our own health and safety, we also can't be good caregivers for our pets either. So giving ourselves permission to make those things a priority as well, and to know that that's all part of being a pet owner and providing care for our pets as well, I think is kind of a helpful way to think about it. And again, just that love doesn't equal money and vice versa.
Sure. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for a great presentation, and thank you to our many participants who shared such thoughtful questions in advance and during the presentation. As always, the VMC is here for you 24/7 to help care for your pets, so please do not hesitate to reach out to us. If you enjoyed learning about our team's work tonight, we encourage you to visit our website or reach out to us directly to learn more about our mission to improve the health and well-being of animals and people. And we hope you'll consider supporting Tanya's work leading the VMC social work service as well. And so this is our final series for the season before we take the summer off. We're so grateful to everyone who joined us throughout the year. Thank you for making us a part of your day, and we look forward to seeing you again when this series restarts at the beginning of next academic year. Thanks so much, and have a great night, everyone.